Welcome to part 10 of this Excel VBA user forms tutorial. This video is going to explain how to use scroll bar controls. And if you've watched the previous video in the series on spin buttons, you'll be right at home with some of the basics because scroll bars are very similar. So I'll explain how you can draw scroll bars and set their orientation, whether that's vertical or horizontal. And we'll explain some of the basic properties such as the minimum, maximum and default values. We'll talk about the difference between the change and the scroll events, just like for spin buttons, and also explain how you can synchronize the value of a scroll bar with the value of a text box. We'll do a couple of examples in this video. The first simple one will be to do with simple numeric values, and then later on we'll explain how you can use a scroll bar to scroll through a range of dates. So let's get started. In the previous video, we looked at how to use a spin button, which was great for making small incremental changes to a numeric value. So if you remember, we created this little spin button to increase and decrease the film's runtime in minutes. So each click changes the value by 1. A scroll bar is just basically like a bigger version of that. So you can still make small incremental changes using a scroll bar, increasing and decreasing by 1, but you can also click inside the scroll bar to make larger changes. So in this case I've set it to change by 10, and you can also just click and drag on the scroll bar itself to increase and decrease at whatever rate you want. You can also do slightly more clever things with your scroll bars, just like with the spin button. It's not just about controlling the actual value of a number. You can use the value stored in the scroll bar to do more interesting things. So I've got a scroll bar here that lets the user choose what date the film was released on. So I can scroll up and down individually by day. I've got it set so I can scroll by a single month if I click into the scroll bar itself. And of course I can just click and drag on the scroll bar to change the dates more rapidly. So this video is going to show you how to create both of those two scroll bars, starting with the basic one that controls just a numeric value. Let's start by drawing the scroll bar that will control the film's runtime in minutes value. So you'll find the scroll bar tool right next to the spin button on the toolbox, so I can click on the scroll bar tool, then I'm going to click and drag to draw my scroll bar. I'm going to make it a horizontal one. You can draw vertical scroll bars as well. All you need to do to make that work is, if I just demonstrate the principle, draw a scroll bar that's taller than it is wide. So the orientation of the scroll bar is sort of worked out automatically. It's based on a single property of the scroll bar called orientation. So you'll see that in the properties window, the orientation property is set to auto. So if I drew my scroll bar, if I changed its width and its height so that it was short and fat, it would change to a horizontal scroll bar. Now if you prefer, you can always make the orientation of a scroll bar either vertical or horizontal by changing the orientation property. So if I choose vertical for this one, then no matter how short and fat it is, it will always be a vertical scroll bar. I'm just going to delete that one and go back to the one that I've drawn, make it slightly shorter, and there is our basic scroll bar set up, ready to control the film's runtime. Next we can change a few properties of the scroll bar to set it up so it works pretty much like the spin button does currently. So let's change its name first of all from scroll bar 1. I'm going to call this one Film Runtime Scroll. Now scroll bars share a lot of properties with spin buttons, so I'm going to view the properties window in categorized view at this point and then scroll down to the scrolling category, just like for the spin button. And we've got a min and a max property, again just like a spin button. So the min is set to 0, which is what I want for the scroll bar. That's the same as the spin button currently. The max is set to 32,767. It sounds like a slightly odd number. That's the maximum value allowable by the integer data type. The actual maximum value allowed by a scroll bar is 2,147,483,647. And no, I didn't just memorize that. I was reading that off a script. So that corresponds to the largest data type, or the largest value that you can hold in the long data type. If you try to make that one more than that value, then you get an invalid property value. So that's the absolute maximum. I don't think I mentioned in the previous video either that that you can't store decimal values in scroll bars or spin buttons. It's got to be a whole number. So I can't say and 0.5. That's invalid as well. Anyway, the value that I want for this scroll bar, the maximum value, is going to be 300 because that will correspond to the maximum value of the spin button as it currently is. Two more properties just to quickly change, and these are related to how the value of the scroll bar changes as you scroll through it. So just like with a spin button, there's a small change property which is set to 1. So the small change property is associated with clicking on the left and the right arrows, or the up and the down arrows with a vertical scroll bar. So it's how much the value changes each time you click on one of those buttons. There's also a large change property. Now this is associated with what happens when you click in between the left and right or the up and down arrows. So if I clicked into the scroll bar, it would change by this amount. So I'm going to increase that to a value of 10, just giving you a way to change that slightly more quickly. Now the next thing to do is make sure that when we change the value of the scroll bar, it actually does something to change the value of our other controls. So just like a spin button, the scroll bar by itself contains the value but doesn't display it anywhere. So ordinarily, if you just had a scroll bar and a text box, you'd make the scroll bar change the value of the text box when the scroll bar change event is triggered. What we're going to do, because of what we set up in the previous video, I'm going to make this scroll bar actually change the value of the spin button. We've already added some code that when the spin button value changes, the value of the text box changes automatically, and correspondingly when the value of the text box changes, it changes the value of the spin button. So what we're going to do is make it so that when the scroll bar changes, the spin button value changes, and then when the spin button changes, it changes the value of the scroll bar correspondingly. So to do all that, we need to start by looking at the change event of the scroll bar. So the simplest way to do that is to double click on the scroll bar, and that will generate the default event for that object, which is the change event. The code that we need to write here is pretty straightforward. All we need to do is change the value of the film runtime spin button. So film runtime.value equals film runtime scroll.value. If I scroll up a little bit, we need to reciprocate so that the spin button's change event triggers a change in the film runtime scroll bar as well. So the procedure we've written here is slightly more complex. We added all this code in the previous video to change the width of the label and change its color. The important bit here is we're changing the text box's value to display the value. All we're going to do there is add an extra line that changes the film runtime scroll value as well. So film runtime scroll.value equals film runtime.value. Okay, so with all that done, we've already got the code in as well for the film runtime text box change event. So scrolling a bit further down, we've got all the validation in there to make sure that the user types in a number and that the number is within the min and max range of the spin button. And as long as all that's true, it will change the value of the spin button. And if the value of the spin button changes, it will now also change the value of the scroll bar. Ordinarily, you'd only have, I suspect, either a spin button or a scroll bar for a single text box. We're slightly complicating the issue here by adding in the scroll bar as well. But it should all work, so let's give it a quick test. If we switch back into Excel now, and if we display the form on screen, we should be able to change the value using the spin button, and you should be able to see that the scroll bar changes. And I should be able to change the value of the scroll bar, and the spin button and the text box again change, and changing the value of the spin button again has retained the value of the scroll bar as well. I can also click inside the scroll bar to change in larger increments, so in increments of 10, which is quite nice, and again that will be picked up by the spin button as well. And I can also just click and drag with the scroll bar. So you can see that as I release the mouse button, it has made a much larger change. It's slightly disappointing that when I click and drag on the scroll bar that I have to wait to release the mouse button before anything else updates. So the change event is triggered when you've actually finally finished dragging on the scroll bar. There is an event of a scroll bar that's triggered as you change, so as you actually literally scroll, and the event is called scroll. So we're going to add a little bit of extra code to make this change as I'm dragging the scroll bar rather than waiting until I've finished releasing the mouse button. So let's cancel out of the dialog box and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we're going to go back to the code behind the scroll bar, so I can double click on the scroll bar. And rather than the change event, I'm going to use the drop down list at the top right hand corner to choose the scroll event instead. All we're going to do in here is exactly the same thing as we've done with the change event. So I'm going to select and copy and paste that code directly into the scroll event, and that will have the desired effect. So if I go back to Excel now and I launch the form again, I'll find this time when I scroll the scroll bar, it changes as I'm dragging rather than waiting until I release the mouse button. Okay, so adding the scroll bar to control just a numeric value is fairly straightforward. What we'd like to do next is add a scroll bar that lets the user change the release date of the film. And that's going to take a little bit more effort to get that to work. But let's start by cancelling out of the dialog box and heading back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we'll just set up the actual scroll bar itself by drawing it in the form. So I'm going to need to give myself a little bit more room here, so I'm going to increase the height of the form a little bit, move these buttons down, then increase the height of the frame. In fact, just to keep all the frames the same height, I'm going to select them all and then increase them all at the same time. I just noticed that one on the right hand side isn't quite the same height as the other ones. Sorry for being fussy, but there we go. Okay, right, so then what we want to do is move all of the controls below the release date down towards the bottom of the frame, so we can select them all at the same time, and then we can draw another scroll bar just below the release date. So let's draw a scroll bar, and again it's going to be a horizontal one, and then I'm going to give this one a sensible name. I'm going to call it Film Date Scroll. So let's change its name in the Properties window, Film Date Scroll. Okay, so before we can start setting properties of this scroll bar effectively, we need to know a little bit about how dates work in VBA. So a scroll bar can only contain a numeric value, and we're trying to get it to store a date. Unfortunately, a date is just a fancily formatted number to all intents and purposes. So just to demonstrate a little tiny bit about how they work, let's head to the View menu and choose Immediate Window. And we're just going to ask a few little questions in the Immediate Window to demonstrate how dates work. First of all, you probably know already that there's a function in VBA that returns today's date, called date. So if I type a question mark into the immediate window and ask to see the result of the dates function, when I hit enter, it shows me what today's date is. There's an equivalent function that returns the date and the time as well, so if I type in question mark now and press enter, it gives me the date and the time. Now, even though we're showing formatted versions of the dates and times here, all of these values are just numbers behind the scenes. If I want to see what the actual number is, I can use one of VBA's conversion functions to do that. So I'm going to type in a question mark and say CLNG, convert to a long integer. And then I'm going to pass into that the date function. And if I hit enter this time, it showed me what value today's date is, 42,454. I can do a similar thing with the now function as well. If I try to do this with the convert to long integer, an integer is just a whole number, so it actually strips off the date and time component. If I said question mark CDBL, convert to a double, so a double data type can contain decimal places. If I convert now to a decimal value, it gives me the proportion through today that I'm already through. So every full 24-hour period has a value of 1. So this represents how far through I am in the 24-hour period between midnight and midnight of today's date. So we know that already that a scroll bar and a spin button can't contain decimal values, so we're kind of restricted to using just the whole numbers anyway. But if we know that we can convert any date into a number, then that gives us a couple of interesting things we can do in terms of setting the min and the max and the value of our scroll bar. Now, in terms of the minimum and maximum dates that you can use, VBA and Excel work ever so slightly differently. So the max date is actually the same in both systems. If I type in a question mark CLNG, and then if I want to enter a date into the VB editor, I need to wrap it up in a set of hash marks. And by default, you should do this in a US format, so month, day, year. So it says 12/31/9999. Close the hash marks, close the parentheses, and that will give me the value of the latest date available. And that's the same as the latest date available in Excel, 31st of December 1999. Now the minimum date is slightly different in both systems. If I see the minimum date available in VBA, CLNG, 1st of the 1st, 100. That's the earliest date that you can use in VBA. If I try to enter a year that was earlier than the year 100, so for instance 99, then VBA will treat that as 1999. So if I enter that, I'll get a much larger number than I got previously. So there's no way to enter a year earlier than the year 100. The slightly annoying thing is that in Excel, the earliest date you can use is the 1st of January 1900, not 100. So if I do that, then I'll get a much larger number, so the number 2. So Excel can't handle dates with a negative raw value. It's probably worthwhile mentioning, you may know already that if Excel treats dates as numbers, you may know already that in Excel that number is slightly different compared to VBA. In fact, if I just switch into Excel, if I type in the 1st of January 1900 into a cell, and then I convert that number into, or just format it as a number, then I will find that in Excel it's actually the number 1 rather than the number 2. This isn't something we have to worry about. We're not going to be passing the raw underlying value of the number into Excel. We're going to be passing the value as a date, and Excel will deal with any conversions required, so we don't need to worry about this fact. So I'm just going to delete that value and head back to the Visual Basic editor. So now that we know what the minimum and maximum values are, what we're going to do is write some code that sets the min of this scroll bar to be the long version of the 1st of the 1st 1900, or in this case the number 2. And then we're going to set its max value. If you remember from one of the earlier videos in the series, we're not allowed to enter future dates for film release dates. So we're going to make sure that the maximum value is the long version of today's date, which is currently 42,454. We can't just do this in the properties window. We can't write expressions into this properties window here. So we need to do this in code, and a sensible place to do this is in the initialize event of the form. So let's close down the immediate window, and then to get to the initialize event of the form, the quickest, simplest thing to do is double click on the form's background, and that will take us straight to the initialize event. So we've already got a lot of code in here from previous videos, including a little section here that sets up the default values for the film runtime spin button. And of course, changing the value of the spin button changes the value of the scroll bar, so that's why the scroll bar has its default value set to 100 as well. What we'll do is just add in a bit more code down at the bottom here now, and we're going to say film date scroll dot min equals, and we could just hard code the number 2 in there, which would be fairly simple and straightforward. We could have even just done that in the properties window earlier on. What I'd like to do though is just to keep things consistent, and in case we decide to change the date later on, and to make it a bit more obvious to anybody else reading the code what's happening here, we're going to say CLNG hashmark 1/1/1900, so setting the earliest available date to be the 1st of Jan 1900. The max is, we'll do in a similar way, so we'll say film date scroll dot max equals CLNG, and then we want to refer to whatever today's date is. So this will change each time we load the form. This will be based on whatever today's date is. So CLNG date. Now I'd also like to change the default value of the film date scroll bar to be equal to today's date, or at least the long integer equivalent of today's date. So I'm going to say film date scroll dot value is also equal to CLNG date. The other thing that I've got to do as well is make sure that when I change the value of the scroll bar, the value of the text box changes at the same time. So I'm going to use my drop down list at the top to find my film date scroll object. Film date scroll, there it is. And if I select that object from the list, it will automatically generate the change event handler. So essentially what I'm going to do here is the reverse of what I've done to set the default value. So I'm going to change the film date text box. And I'm going to change the text property of this. The reason I'm using text rather than value is because the text property will use the regional settings of my computer in terms of date formatting. So I'm going to say filmdate.text equals, then we saw the CLNG function to convert to a long. There's also a CDate function to convert data to a date. So CDate, and I'm going to say film date scroll dot value. Okay, so having done all of that, let's give this one a quick little test. If we go back into Excel and then we launch the form, we should see that the scroll bar is set to a default value and it's set to today's date. Because that's the max, we'll see the scroll bar scroll right to the very, very end. And we should see as we scroll backwards, it changes the value of the date by 1. So the small change property of the scroll bar is set to 1, and scrolling back up increases the value. So the basics of that is now working. We also need to make sure that when we change the value of the text box, the value of the scroll bar updates as well, because currently that's not going to happen. If I manually enter a date into the text box, the scroll bar's value hasn't changed, so scrolling the scroll bar just resets the value of the text box to whatever the value the scroll bar has. So to make that work, we're going to change some of the code behind the after update event of the text box. Let's close down the form, head back to the VB editor, and then double click the release date text box to get to its after update event. So we added some code to the after and before update events in a previous video. The before update event essentially validates the text box to make sure the user has entered a date value and that date value isn't greater than today's date. So we can only reach the after update event if we've entered a valid value in the first place. So what we should have to do here is change the value of the film date scroll to be equal to the converted value, so we'll use the same technique, CLNG, of the film date.value. Now, currently this isn't actually going to work. If I switch back into Excel and then show the form on screen and enter a date in here that's definitely a valid date, almost, and then if I try to scroll from it, or in fact if I just try to move away from this text box at all, just to trigger the after update event, it's going to cause a crash. And the reason this happens, if I hit the debug button, is that the value returned by a text box, or the text property, it wouldn't matter if I use the value or the text property here. You can probably see from the tooltip, this is being returned as a string of text, not a date. So the double quotes enclosing the value there indicate that it's a string. And I can't directly convert that string into a long integer. So I'm going to hit the reset button and then go back to the Visual Basic editor, double click that text box again. What I have to do is convert the value of the text box into a date and then convert that into a long integer. So it's a bit convoluted, although the expression itself isn't too bad. So if I just wrap up the film date value in a CDate function and then convert all of that into a long integer, this will now finally work. So if I head back to Excel and if I show the form on screen, try to change the date manually by typing that in, I can't type in an invalid date, by the way, so if I try to type in an invalid date, I'm prevented from moving away altogether. That's what this validation code was doing earlier. So if I do enter an actual valid date now, I should find that the scroll bar scrolls from that date because it will have picked up on the change. So there we go, there's the basics of that working. Next few things to do are to do things like change the scroll event to make sure that that changes as I'm scrolling rather than waiting until I've released the mouse button. And also making sure that when I click in between the scroll bar, making sure that it changes by more than just one day at a time. So getting the text box to update as I drag the scroll bar is really straightforward. I just need to use the scroll event of the scroll bar. So I can double click on the scroll bar to get to its change event and then choose the scroll event from the list just as we did earlier on, and all I'm going to do is copy and paste that exact same line of code from the previous event procedure. So having done that, if I switch back into Excel now and launch the form, I can happily drag the scroll bar and it will update as I drag rather than waiting until I release the mouse button. So that's a relatively simple problem to solve. Getting the scroll bar to change in larger increments when I click in between the arrows is also fairly straightforward. As long as I want regular increments, all I have to do is select the scroll bar, head down to the scrolling section in the properties window and make the large change equal to a larger number. So let's say 30 sort of arbitrarily, sort of rough and ready way of changing by 1 month per click. So if I do that and then I go back to Excel and then I run the form, I should be able to click into the scroll bar and it will change by essentially 30 days at a time, which is roughly equivalent to 1 month. Not quite, but close enough. If you wanted this to be a little bit cleverer though and scroll by exactly 1 month at a time, that's somewhat trickier. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, but it's a lot of effort to get it to work. What we should do is every time we change the value of the scroll bar, we want to recalculate the large change property so that it will be exactly equal to 1 month prior to the date that we've currently got selected. So there's a couple of functions that can help with that. There's a date diff and a date add function in Excel. So I'll have a quick go at making that work and then show you some slight limitation to it as well. So I'm going to close down the form and then head back to the Visual Basic editor. So just to demonstrate the principle of the two functions involved here, let's view the immediate window again. And I've already cleared its contents from the last time I used it. I'm going to type in a quick question mark here. I'm going to say date diff open parentheses, and then I've got 3 compulsory parameters to fill in. First of all is the interval of time I want to use. So in that case, it's going to be a D in double quotes. I want to find out the number of days difference between 2 dates. The second parameter is the first date. Usually it's the earliest of the 2 dates you want to test for. So let's say I want to find out what is the difference between the 1st of January in this year. I want to find out how many days it's been until today's date. So the third parameter, date 2, I'm going to pass in a reference to the date function. So if I hit enter at the end of that, it tells me there's 84 days between the 1st of Jan 2016 and whatever today's date is. The other function involved is date add. What I really want to be able to do here is I want to find out what is the difference in days between today's date and the date that is 1 month prior to today's date. So to calculate the date that is 1 month prior to today's date, I can use the date add function. Again, I need to specify the interval of time I'm interested in, and in this case it's going to be an M for months. The number is going to be -1, and then the date that I want to refer to is date. So if I enter that, that calculates the date 1 month prior to today. If I then just combine those two functions together, so if I copy and paste the date add function, replace that second parameter of the date diff function with that. When I look at the result, that gives me the number of days between today's date and the same date last month. All I've got to do now is replace the references to the dates functions to a reference of the value stored in the scroll bar converted into a date. So we can add that code in to the change event of the scroll bar. So now what we want to do is, when the value of this film date scroll bar changes, we want to change its large change property. So film date scroll dot large change equals. Then just to save myself a whole bunch of typing, not because I'm lazy, I'm just going to copy and paste that expression that I've put into the immediate window and paste it in. What I have to do then is change the references to the date function, because now we're going to be basing this based on the value of the film date scroll. And those need to be converted into a date as well. So I'm going to say cdate, and then open a set of parentheses and say film date scroll dot value, and then close an extra set of parentheses, and do the exact same thing here for the date function. So again, a quick copy and paste. I'll copy cdate film date scroll.value and place that over the top of the reference to the date function. So it looks a bit messy when I look at the whole thing in one single screen width. Let me just see if I can get that separated out onto different lines so we can see the whole thing in one go. Let's see, there we go. So let's give this one a quick test. If we head back to the VB editor now, head back to Excel from the VB editor and then show the form on screen, I should find that if I click on the scroll bar now, it goes back from the 25th of March to the 25th of Feb. And if I click on the scroll bar again, it'll go to the 25th of Jan and 25th of December, and so on and so on and so on. So it keeps the increments nice and consistent. I can still scroll to get different days, and I can still click on the scroll bars here, scroll buttons to get different days, but clicking anywhere in the scroll bar going backwards scrolls by exactly 1 month each time. Now there is one minor irritation with the way this system works based on the way I've written it. Although it works great for scrolling backwards through months, the change is exactly 1 month each time. If I started scrolling back up through the months, that's not quite the case. You'll see the number of the day of the month changes depending on exactly which month I'm scrolling through. The reason for this is because we've used the date add function to detect essentially the length of the month that is 1 month prior to the date that we've currently got selected. So going backwards works, but going forwards doesn't. This would be a really easy problem to solve if a scroll bar had separate scroll down and scroll up events. Just like a spin button has a separate spin up and a spin down event, you can do different things based on going up or down, but a scroll bar doesn't have that, sadly. So I haven't found a simple solution to this problem yet, so for the time being I'm going to leave that system working as it is, and we'll just have to accept a minor difference in the day of the month change when we click into the scroll bar. Hopefully we can live with that though for the time being. Okay, so there's a couple of last little problems that we have to solve with our date system just before we wrap up. It's to do with the date formatting. In previous videos I've always made sure to enter my date formats in a completely unambiguous way. So for Deadpool, I've added loads and loads of times in my list, I've said 12 Feb 2016. So that's completely unambiguous. The problem with the system that I've got it working now is that if I move away from that text box, because the scroll bar updates its value, which then subsequently updates the text box, it reverts back to the standard formatting, so 12/02/2016. Now that's ambiguous. That could be either the 12th of Feb or December the 2nd. And if I were to add this to the list, I'll find out that actually it comes in as a 2nd of December, which isn't quite what I wanted. So there's a couple of ways I could solve this problem. First of all, I'm going to click OK to get back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then what we're going to do is we're going to modify some of the code behind the change event of our scroll bar. So I'm going to double click the scroll bar to get back to its change event. So all I'm going to do here is format the value that I'm passing back into the text property of the film date text box. So I'm going to use the format function, which we've seen in this series before. And then I'm going to apply a format that is a single D, which will give me the day of the month, 3 M's for a short code for the month name, and then 4 Y's to give me the 4-digit year. And I want to do the same thing for the change event and for the scroll event. So while I'm here, I'm going to copy and paste that expression into the scroll event as well. So, having done that, if I switch back into Excel now and just start to add in a new film, you'll see already that the formatting of that text box has changed. I don't really care too much about what values I choose here. I can enter a different value by typing it in still. I can type in 12 Feb 2016 and that will work. I can scroll up and down from there, so that all still works as well. So it purely is just the formatting of that text box that's changed. The really important thing is that when I finally do add this into the list, that because that date format is completely unambiguous, Feb must be February. It can't possibly represent anything else. If I click Add to List now, I'll find that it has now entered as the 12th of the 2nd rather than the 2nd of the 12th. So that's perfect. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the YSL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.